Good afternoon. Oh, great. What a good group. So it is my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you all to the Henderson Lecture. This lecture is named after Lucile Kelling Henderson, who was a faculty member and dean here at the School of Information and Library Science. She was faculty member from 1932 to 1960 and dean from 1954 to 1960. An amazing teacher and leader, and this award, or this lecture, was set up in 1990 to honor her memory. We're extremely pleased to have as our annual Henderson Lecturer this year one of our own alumna, Dr. Cassidy Sugimoto, who is here from Indiana University. Cassidy, you can read the bio. I promised her I wasn't going to read the entire sort of thing here, but Cassidy has been doing some of the most innovative work in what we tend to call bibliometrics or webometrics, and she's been awarded National Science Foundation grants, IMLS grants, and grants from foundations like the Sloan Foundation. She's publishing up a storm. I don't know how she gets a chance to sleep with all the writing she does, the teaching, and the leadership, as well as having a young family that she takes really, really good care of. If you follow her on Facebook, you know. She was the president of the Indiana University Faculty Council, which is our huge responsibility for someone as young as Cassidy. So we're extremely pleased to have her here today. She's going to talk about what does it matter who is speaking. This is based on some studies of the roles of gender in the scholarly process. And I think this work is extremely important. It's getting attention in the top journals, the Sciences and Natures of the world, and then of course in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And it's my estimation that she's really just begun. So please join me in welcoming Cassidy Sugimoto.
Thank you, Gary. As evidence that I do have elementary school children, you'll hear the sound of my voice today for this lingering cough that anyone else who has elementary school children can appreciate. But I'm delighted and honored to be here today to be this year's Henderson speaker. We're going to cover many themes in today's talk: the heterogeneity of scholarly communication, imbalances in the scientific workforce, and technological innovations which are causing disruptions, both positive and negative, for the scholarly ecosystem. At the heart of today's talk, and really all of my research, is one simple question: who has a voice in science? That is, who gets to participate in science? Who chooses what science is done and what questions are asked? How do these people get to participate in science? And how is labor distributed among different populations of science? And when you labor in science, how are you rewarded for that labor? And are people equitably rewarded? And who gets to choose what is valuable in science? What constitutes impact in science? To tell this story, I'm going to weave three strains of my research today. So the first looks at authorship and contributorship, that is the labor roles that are distributed in science. The second will look at gender differences in science and the scientific workforce. And the third area, I'll look at broader impacts in science, most notably looking at social media metrics, or Altmetrics. I'll end today's talk with a discussion of the infrastructural implications. How do we build an infrastructure for scholarly communication that takes and addresses all of these issues of heterogeneity? So we'll begin. The title for this talk, What Does It Matter Who is Speaking, comes from Foucault's What is an Author? And in the world of scholarly communication, it matters a lot. Authorship is the coin of the realm. It is the currency around which all of the reward system of science pivots. When one is assigned an authorship to a paper, that generates capital for them in the academic marketplace. The more publications, the more capital you have. The more citations that accrue to those publications, the more capital you generate. And that capital can be spent in various ways in scholarly communication. Now, of course, there's a Janus-based nature to this capital. On the one hand, you have ownership. You have the rights that accumulate along with this publication. But on the other hand, you have responsibility. Responsibility against fraud, against dishonest authorship, against all of these abuses that we've seen, particularly recently, in the scholarly communication ecosystem. Now, this has been challenged in recent years by the growing degrees of hyper-authorship, that is, the enlarging of the authorship lists for each publication. What you see here is a byline from a paper from last year. It had more than 5,000 authors on the publication from higher energy physics, so each of those is an author name. The publication was 23 pages in length. 14 pages were authors. 9 pages were content. So this challenges our notion of what it means to be an author. How are you an author when you're sharing 5,000 authorships? What does that mean? Did you pen the article? What did you contribute to the article? How do we think about labor in science when penning the work is no longer a criteria for authorship? Now, you may think those are just those crazy high-energy physicists and everyone else is still doing science like normal, but we are seeing across all fields invariantly a demise of the single author, of the lone author. So on the left, what you see is for the natural and medical sciences, where in 1900, nearly 90% of authorships were sole authored. That number is now below 10%. Now, the social sciences and humanities are seeing this as well, going from nearly 100% of sole authored work to, in current time periods, less than 40% of their works are written by a single author. This challenges our notion, again, of what it means to be a contemporary author. Now, despite the fact that authorship is so central for scholarly communication, we know relatively little about it. We can sum it up in basically 2 points. One is there are differences by discipline. We know different disciplines do different things. And we know authors do bad things. That's pretty much what we know about authorship. We see honorific authorship, fraud, cartels, all of these kinds of things. But we don't really know much about the heart of what it means to be an author on a contemporary scientific publication. Now, because of this, many organizations have tried to define authorship, to give us criteria for assigning authorship so that we'll do it in standardized ways. So the ICMJE, the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, is perhaps the most well-known. And they said an author should do 4 things. 1, you should be involved in conception and design, acquisition of data, analysis and interpretation, and you should draft the article, and you should have final approval for the article. And this 4th one, which becomes problematic, is you should be accountable for all aspects of the work, and you should have confidence in the integrity of all of your co-authors and be able to identify what they contributed to the work. Now, one can imagine with 5,000 authors, this becomes difficult. Can you really be held accountable for the work of 4,999 other co-authors? Furthermore, authorship fails to capture labor. We can take all of these things, piece them out, decide who should be an author, but at the end of the day, authorship only tells you who contributed, but not the ways in which they contributed. It doesn't tell us what they did to constitute authorship. Now, we're starting to see new forms of attribution that address this. So, for example, the Public Library of Science platform has authorship and contributorship data. We've retained the authorship, those listing of the names on the byline, but to that we've added new data. What you actually contributed. Did you conceive and design the experiments? Did you write the paper? Did you contribute materials or resources? So that becomes another line that we can now parse to know more about what's happening in the scientific system. Now, I also list here acknowledgements, which we're starting to parse on a different level. This has been called sub-authorship for scholarly communication. People who contribute to science, but aren't acknowledged as authors, right? So it creates a sort of hierarchy of authorship and a contribution of labor. Now, the great thing about the Public Library of Science is this is all in XML, so we can mine all of this data and parse it to find out some really interesting things about what's happening in science. So we did this. We took all of those contributorship data, and there were thousands and thousands of idiosyncratic ways in which people identified their contribution. But those really distilled down to 5 main areas. Now, keep in mind, the Public Library of Science journals, beyond their main generalist journal, are primarily biomedical journals, so you'll see that sort of reflected in these types. One was in nearly 100% of the articles, someone analyzed data. In nearly 100%, people conceived and designed experiments. In nearly 75% of them, they contributed some resources, reagents, materials, tools. In nearly 100%, someone did an experiment and wrote a paper. Now, one thing that I want to draw your attention to is this other category. Now, less than 20% of papers had another kind of thing, but there were 20,000 different ways in which people contributed to science. So that's another interesting thing we won't go into in this talk, but to think about what it means to make science. Can we agree upon the different sort of parts of science in order to reduce this sort of idiosyncratic nature of this? So we took these 5 categories and we asked a few things. One is, how distributed is this labor? If there are 5 things that it takes to make a scientific paper, how often is someone doing all 5? And that's our red line here. So in physics, a larger proportion were doing all 5, but in clinical medicine and health and biomedical research, very few people were doing all 5 tasks. On the other hand, the blue that you see on the right-hand side is how many people were only doing a single task. And in many cases, nearly 30% of the authors were only associated with one of those 5 tasks. Now what's striking to me here is if we go to the 50% line and go up, there's not a single discipline in which the majority of the authors are doing 4 or 5 tasks. This tells us that contemporary science is highly distributed. People are distributing the works of science in order to create a product, a publication. Now one thing that's interesting to me when we start thinking about ethics of authorship is how isolated these are. So if you're only doing one task, what is that task that you're doing? And what we found is if you were only doing one thing, the most likely thing you were doing was performing the experiment. Now, some of you may say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but think through the implications of that. The person doing the science is removed from the analysis of it, is removed from the writing of it, was removed from the design of it. That has huge implications when we think about fraud in science, when we think about accountability of science. So we also look to say, well, if you were doing a few tasks, how likely were you to be associated with different things? If you're doing, for example, writing the paper, what are you doing? Well, the person writing the paper was most likely to have conceived and designed the experiments or analyzed the data. So we have one person coming in, conceiving it, sending it off for experimentation, getting it back, analyzing and writing the paper, right? And we have to think about what are the implications of that distribution of labor, of that pattern of science making. Now we also can take each of those categories and say, well, we know from that first thing about authorship that there are disciplinary differences. People do things in really disciplinary specific way. So what constitutes authorship for each of these fields? Well, in the arts and humanities, writing the paper is still very, very important. Nearly 100% of the authors were associated with writing the paper. That became a criteria for authorship. But when we get down to chemistry, biomedical, and clinical medicine, writing the paper isn't as important anymore. It's a different kind of authorship that's important for those disciplines. Finally, we asked, how much does authorship order matter? We've taken for granted in the scholarly communication system for years that first author is the most important. And so we checked how many tasks is first author doing? Well, across all disciplines, they're doing many more tasks than the other authors. Last author, usually the PI or principal investigator in the sciences, was also doing a lot. And our middle authors were doing very little in terms of how many tasks they were doing. So we look at this distribution. Now, many of you may be saying, okay, Cassidy, this is fantastic navel-gazing that scientometricians love to do, right? They like to take science and piece it apart and find these patterns. But how is this important for science globally? And more importantly, how is this important for society? What can we know when we know about contributorship data? So let me introduce to you Dr. Ruth Hubbard. Now in 1974, and this is important, in 1974, Dr. Hubbard was the first woman to be awarded tenure at Harvard in biology. 1974, right? In 1981, she did an interview with the New York Times, and I think her words are much more eloquent in describing the potential of contributorship for understanding more about science and society. She said, and I quote, "Women and non-white, working class, and poor men have largely been outside the process of science making. Though we have been described by scientists, by and large, we have not been the describers and definers of scientific reality. We have not formulated the questions scientists ask, nor have we answered them. This undoubtedly has affected the content of science, but it also affected the social context and the ambience in which science is done." To paraphrase, when we move science in different ways, we change the questions that can be asked, and certain questions are left unanswered. If certain populations are contributing to certain kinds of tasks and not others, if certain populations are left out of science making, or if science making is relegated to certain tasks, it changes the science that's done. It changes what we know about the world and the kinds of questions that we ask. So we took our contributorship data and we said, how can we put sociodemographic characteristics on top of that? Can we see, are certain people allowed to conceive and design the experiments, to analyze the data, to experiment, right? That would tell us more about how labor is distributed in science. So let's turn now to gender differences in science. To start, I'll give a little bit of context from one of our studies. So many people say, okay, women in science, we've made such great progress, it's really not an issue anymore. So we took contemporary data, this is 2008 to 2012, every publication that was in Web of Science, and we assigned a gender to each author, millions of authorship data. And what we found was 30% of the authorships were female and 70% were male. And then we said, well, okay, maybe that's because certain countries are suppressing female authorships. Maybe this is only happening in some places across the globe. And so we mapped it, and what you see is the darker the blue, the more male-dominated production is, and the lighter the pink, the more female-dominated production is. And as you can see, it's a blue world. The only countries that have female domination actually have very, very low production, less than 1,000 articles total, which shows that we actually have a brain drain situation there, where a lot of the capable men are leaving the country and going to other countries for their resources. These countries where women are dominating are not exactly resource-intensive countries. Now, we looked at this for all states and provinces in North America, and we see the same thing, heavy male domination in the production of science. Now again, contemporary data. So we looked at this across discipline. What does this look like when we take all of science and we can map it together? So we overlaid our gender data on a map of science. In the top left-hand corner, you see math and physics, engineering, highly male-dominated. You become closer to parity in many of the biomedical sciences and biology. And when you hit the health professions and many feminized disciplines, you see more women. Social work, librarianship, nursing, education. These are places that had female dominance. And by the time you move back into the humanities, they are male-dominated again. Now, one of the things we wanted to look at is, given the array of hyper-authorship, given that collaboration is becoming this invariant trend, what does that mean for networking women in science? So we took all of the collaborative activity, and we took a very simple measure. What proportion of the collaborative activity for females was national versus international, and for men, national and international? Now, if you just look at the top, we've organized it by how nationalistic collaboration is. Turkey, India, and Iran tend to collaborate highly nationally. Switzerland, Philippines, high internationally. But what's striking about this chart is if you look at the overhang of pink on the left, then in every single country, women were more likely to collaborate domestically than internationally. They were more likely to have networks that were local rather than networks that were international. Now, this becomes very important when we move to the reward system of science and we start thinking about citation metrics in particular. So what you see here is for each of those countries of the highest production, the degree to which a paper is cited. Now, the greener it is, the more highly cited, the redder, the less cited it is. And in the first column, we have single-authored female versus male, where the male-authored papers are cited more highly than the female. We move to the next block of national collaboration, first and last female, first and last male. In each case, the male papers were more heavily cited, and you move to internationally collaborative papers, which are definitely among all the most highly cited, and we see the same patterns. This represents a compound disadvantage for women. Their works are cited lower overall, and they tend to cite nationally, which is cited less overall as well. So the worst possible thing to do in science right now is to be a woman and write alone. So we also turned and said, okay, well, there are lots of other ways you can produce, right? There are lots of kinds of production that we can have. So instead of just looking at papers, let's look at patents as well. So we took patent data from 1976, we overlaid the gender algorithm on it, and we looked to see the proportion of women patenting. Now, it's a bit of a sadder story. In 1976, we had about 3% of patents associated with women, and now we're up to a high of around 14%. One of the interesting and exciting parts of this, though, is that blue line. So what we see here, the yellow line is corporate patenting, and the blue line is university patenting. And we see a lot more growth in women patenting out of universities than in any other sector, suggesting that this may be a potential place for investment, investing in women who are doing entrepreneurial activities within the academic sector. And we see this across all different disciplines, chemistry, electrical engineering, instruments, and mechanical. Other is the only one where we don't see this. And in case you're wondering, other has categories such as furniture and games, and a lot of what we see there is actually male dominance of the gaming industry that plays out there. So going back to contributorship, if we know this about gender, what happens when we integrate our gender data with our contributorship data? Well, we took all 5 of those categories, and we said, what are the odds that each of those is associated with a woman rather than a man? Controlling for age, controlling for collaboration, controlling for discipline, controlling for all these other factors that one can imagine. And women were significantly more likely to be performing the experimentation, and men more likely to be doing everything else, particularly contributing reagents, material, and tools. That is, women's authorship was mostly associated with doing the work of science, whereas men's authorship was most likely to be associated with paying for and providing the resources for science. This disparity was something we found across all disciplines and in a very significant way. Right now, this has fundamental transformations in who gets to ask the questions of science. Women were not more likely to conceive or design an experiment, or to analyze the data, or to write the paper, to tell the story. So doing the experimentation is a very different voice in science than those other kinds of tasks. Now, we looked at this to see if the lead mattered, right? Some of you may say, well, 25% of full professors are female, so what you're seeing here is really just a disparity in PIs and who can be it. So we took female corresponding of first authored papers, and we looked at the distribution of tasks, and male corresponding and male first authors. And what we find is, when women were leading the paper, they were more likely to be associated with all of the tasks except contributing reagents, materials, and tools. And when men were leading the paper, they were more likely to be associated with all the tasks except experimentation. Women were doing the experimentation on male-led teams, men were paying for female-led papers. We see, again, that kind of disparity playing out in these distributions. We also looked at this by the number of authors. Our idea was, well, as you add more authors to this team, labor will be more equally distributed. Women tend to work in smaller teams, so maybe that's accounting for it. So what we were hoping to see is, this kind of nice skew. The more authors you add, the less everyone's doing each of these tasks. And we see that down in D. That shows a male-led paper, how the men performed on that. As we add more men to the paper, fewer of them were associated with each of these tasks. They distributed the labor more equally. Now we can jump over one to that male-led paper when we have females participating on it. Now, for most of the tasks, they followed that same trend, except experimentation. They start by doing the majority of experimentation, and it doesn't matter how many more people you add to that paper, they still do as much experimentation. Again, we see the inverse in the top right-hand corner, how men act when a woman is leading the paper. They don't do experimentation. That's a kind of labor they don't engage in. And on A up at top, we see sort of a more distribution. Women keep working on all of the tasks even as you add more women to the team. Now, we could say, that's poor management, right? That's a mismanagement, and maybe they shouldn't micromanage as much. But given the high rates of fraud, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of team makes sense for science? What kind of science, how should science be made? So we're sort of going to shift gears here a little bit. When we look at all of these metrics, see how people are going, to what end are we laboring? Why are we laboring in the way that we're laboring? And does our science have an impact? What matters here? So we'll turn to sort of the social media metrics portion of this, where we can talk a little bit more about altmetrics and ways of measuring broader impact. First, we have to say, what constitutes broader impact? What do we mean by broader impact? Everyone's saying this. Do we have a shared understanding of what it is? So the Research Excellence Framework, which is the major funding and resource investment strategy within the United Kingdom that allocates resources to all of the institutions, defines impact in a very specific way. Now, this impact accounts for 20% of their calculation in how resources are allocated to their university. And they say it's any effect on, change or benefit to the economy, society, culture, public policy or services, health, the quality of life beyond academia. This is a really important point for them. They are not interested in the impact of science on science, but the impact of science on society. What are you doing to break out from the ivory tower? How is your work having an impact beyond citation count, beyond what we see in terms of the ivory tower? Similarly, the National Science Foundation asks us to broaden our dissemination to students, scientists, engineers, members of Congress, teachers, and the general public. This is a huge criteria for funding within the National Science Foundation. At my own institution, Indiana University, we asked for a similar thing. We asked to look at public scholarship, how we expand our range of audiences. And many funding agencies are looking for the same thing. What is your level of engagement with different communities, non-academic communities? So why altmetrics? Why have we turned to altmetrics as a potential source for broader impact? Well, let me go back a little bit and just define what altmetrics is. So it was coined by a doctoral student, Jason Priem, which appropriately he coined it in a tweet. But he said three things which I think are really important to know about altmetrics. The first is he said altmetrics are an approach to uncovering previously invisible traces of scholarly impact. That is, to make manifest what was invisible, all of these traces of interactions, ways in which people are influenced by or interacting with scholarship, but had remained invisible. What he wanted to do was grab those, to capture those, and be able to use those as traces of impact. And he argued that citations miss many important kinds of impact. Again, they are just science on science, but not science on society at large. And again, he criticized citations and the scholarly communication system as being formal and rigid, while scholarship itself was fast and messy, and we needed to capture some of that was happening, particularly given all of the rise of social media platforms. So simply put, the promise of Altmetrics is that scholars do many things. They teach, they go to conferences, they publish, they analyze data, they read, they occasionally have private lives. All of these things make up scholarship, right? All of these things that a scholar does. But citations only do one thing. They capture that publishing output. And they only look and see what other scholars think about that one publishing output. They don't look at who you mentor. They don't look at what you do in the classroom. They don't look at your community service engagement. All that we look at in current contemporary metrics are publications. And the idea was that Altmetrics could open up all of those nodes, tell us about all of the things, collect data on all of the kinds of interactions, and in doing that, be able to show a more holistic approach to what our impact on society is. So, have they met those goals? Well, we'll go through a few different kinds of broader impacts and discuss whether they've met these idealized things. Well, unfortunately, that first goal wasn't met. Altmetric indicators do not measure a broader array of genres than citations. We have all of those things, but they have focused again on publishing works. Most altmetric aggregators grab the DOI, or the document identifier, to try to pull publications. So what we're getting are traces of those publications again, not traces of teaching, not traces of conference attendance, but still focusing on the journal article as the document of record, as the piece of scholarship. Now we have, however, enlarged what we measure about that article. Not just citations to that article, but Facebook mentions, Twitter mentions, Mendeley mentions, Wikipedia mentions, mentions in the news, in policy documents. So there's a growing heterogeneity in the traces of impact, but for a single genre. Now, while we've had more heterogeneous altmetrics, unfortunately the indicators have not also incorporated that. Most of our altmetrics reduce themselves to a single number. So altmetric.com is the largest aggregator of altmetric data, and they collect many things: tweets, Facebook pages, Google+, Reddit, blogging, faculty of 1,000, but all of that is reduced down to a single number. Now when we think about broader impacts, each of those has a different implication. If you appear in the news a lot, that's a different implication than being on Twitter a lot. Different implication than being on policy document a lot. Now, this isn't a normative value of which is better, but to say that they are very different, and they have different implications for your broader impact. So suppressing that to one single number is really problematic from a policy perspective. Now, this also becomes problematic due to the wide difference in coverage of those indicators. So what you see up here is the coverage of things in Web of Science. Nearly 70% of articles right now receive at least one citation. Right? They are made visible through that trace of impact. Mendeley is close by. Nearly 70% of articles appear on Mendeley, which is a reference manager. Only about 20% of articles ever get tweeted, and less than 1% of articles are in the news or in a policy document. So given that widespread, those really affect a single score altmetric indicator. Those are going to be heavily influenced by your Mendeley count, and to a lesser extent, by your Twitter count. The same goes for mean count per paper. We actually see more papers on Mendeley than we see in Web of Science, because people can put something in their library multiple times and multiple people can put the same document in their library. Twitter, Facebook, policy documents, all of those are less than 1%. And all of these tend to be moderately correlated with citations, asking us if they really tell us a different story. Mendeley counts make sense. Students, faculty members are using those. They're using them to write a paper that then they'll then cite. We should expect a high correlation. A policy document could be a very different kind of place. So we have to think about the weaknesses of these indicators when they suppress all of that information. Now, altmetric indicators are also very easily gamed. Here's one of my favorite examples, a physics paper. The title asks, can apparent superluminal neutrino speeds be explained as a quantum weak measurement? And if you look down to the abstract, probably not. Now this was tweeted, more than 4,000 times. Oh, press here to begin. I want to begin. 4,000 times, and it wasn't for the amazing scientific content of this paper. Rather, almost all of these 5,000 tweets said, best abstract ever. Right? So we have to ask ourselves what we're measuring at 5,000 tweets. Now people say citations can be gamed, and they can. But can you cite something 5,000 times for humor? right? There's a gatekeeping function in scholarly publication which keeps this number down. We see it, it's possible, but it's not at this scale, right? The scale and the virality of social media platforms changes how we can interpret these indicators. Similarly, we have to think about the different participants in this dissemination function. So we've done a study of social media metrics and found that nearly 10% were bots. So when we ask ourselves about broader impact, do I want to have a broader impact upon bots or upon humans? Right? It's a very different kind of implication when we know this. A lot of the engagement that we see on social media is what we would say is low engagement. It's the title retweeted over and over again. No indication that people actually engaged with the text at all. Very few of these articles have what we call high engagement, people commenting on the text, actually engaging in a discourse around this text, which means Twitter is a great dissemination vehicle, but not a very good interaction vehicle when it comes to communicating science. And so we have to try to piece out what's happening in these spaces so that we don't mistake attention for impact. Now, many people, again, with broader impacts, the implication is that these are social impacts. But we have to ask ourselves, impact upon whom? Again, is it science upon science or science upon society? So we've done a few tests of this. Now, these altmetric aggregators, like altmetric.com that I mentioned, often try to categorize your impact. So they'll say, for this article, here's the percent of tweets that came from scientists, from the public, from practitioners, and from communicators. So we said, this is great, this is amazing, right? We can break out our impact, we can understand our impact. So we did a random sample from each of these categories. And we said, okay, very simple question. Of the people you categorized as scientists, how many had a doctoral degree? Now, 63% of scientists had a doctoral degree. That's a pretty strong signal. We were comfortable with that. What about the public? What percentage of the public has a doctoral degree? 34% of the public has a doctoral degree, and nearly a third of practitioners and communicators as well. Given that we know that less than 2% of the public has a doctoral degree, there's something wrong with the classification scheme for these things, right? So we're highly overestimating what we think of as the public, and what we're showing is the great percentage of the people who are tweeting about science using a DOI are other scientists. So we've taken that and said, well, not just scientists, people with a Ph.D., but are there people who don't have a Ph.D. but are on that track? And we see a large number of bachelor students, master students, Ph.D. students. These are the people who are tweeting about science. Again, not this mythical lay public, but scientists. So we reject the claim that scientists, that social impact is shown on Altmetrics, but rather it's another way of showing scientific impact. Now, when we look at this also and take our top scientists who are on that, we'd say, okay, this is fine. We have scientists on it, but who are these people? Well, we see people like Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins. These are the people who are coming up on science, and in terms of scientists on Twitter. So we have to also, again, think about science popularizers versus scientists and what's represented in the discourse on Twitter. So right now, we're very good at identifying scientists. We can see when we see them. But I will claim that we don't really know what we don't know yet here, right? So those people that we can't classify, we know very little about them. Their bio may say, you know, I love yoga, chocolate, and dogs. And maybe they're a neuroscientist, but we don't know, right? So there's a lack of identification of people on Twitter, and so there's still a lot that's unknown in that space. But at present, we know that a lot of this conversation is being dominated by scientists. Now, so then we said, okay, maybe it's just scientists on Twitter, but maybe they're talking to new scientists that they've never spoken before. Maybe this is going to democratize this ivory tower. We're going to break out of our disciplinary domains, and we'll do that. Well, no, that's not true either. So we went and said, who's on Twitter, right? What disciplines are represented on Twitter? And we were really excited. Historians are out in force on Twitter, right? Our psychologists, our physicists, our political scientists, right? A wide array of disciplines that are utilizing Twitter. So this was promising for us. We thought, okay, great, all of these different disciplines represented on Twitter, and in different composition than you see in Web of Science or other scientometric plays, many more humanists than we normally see. This is exciting, right? We're going to see them talking to each other. So first we asked, well, how representative of this is this of the scientific workforce? And what we found are our social scientists are widely overrepresented on Twitter. They are tweeting all the time, and our mathematicians really don't have time for Twitter. So really underrepresented compared to what you would expect. Now, we took all of their retweets and their mentions and their followers and their networks, and we tried to figure out what makes the scientific Twitter network. And given their composition, our computer scientists, our mathematicians, really underrepresented. And what we see is really the life and physical scientists holding together the Twitter network. That became sort of the core aspects of the Twitter network. But then we dug in deeper to look at these subgroups. And our historians, who were once our heroes, our big tweeters, are almost completely isolated from the Twitter network. They're talking to other historians. But political scientists are also talking to political scientists, sociologists to sociologists, ecologists to ecologists. And when we take the entire map of Twitter and we run assortativity analyses, we find birds of a feather flock together. People still talk in very disciplinary, bounded ways. We haven't broken out of the ivory tower in here. Twitter is replicating the same kinds of isolations that we see in the scholarly literature. So then we thought, okay, they're maybe not talking cross-disciplinary boundaries, but maybe they're reaching a different geographic audience. That is how we're going to broaden impact. And I'm sorry to say that that is also not true. So what we did is we took citation networks versus Twitter networks. And I know this is a really complicated sort of thing to pull down here, but if you look at the right hand, it's our citation and our references. It's saying, who do you cite, who's citing, and whose papers are being cited. And you see the dominance of the diagonal, which tells you in every case, Asia is more likely to cite Asian papers than anyone else. Europe, more likely to cite European papers. North America, North American papers. We tend to cite and reference in really localized ways. When you move over to the Twitter side, on the left-hand side, you see the dominance of Europe and North America on the top, and Europe and North America on the bottom. Meaning European and North American papers are the ones being tweeted, and they're being tweeted by Europeans and North Americans. Right? Now, this makes sense on a lot of levels. We look at China has Weibo, it has other kinds of platforms, and we're using Twitter here. But this is showing that in many ways, altmetrics are really perpetuating the same disparities that we've seen before. The westernization and the Western control of these metrics is seen as Twitter, just like it's seen in other kinds of scholarly indicators. So I don't want to leave you with all bad news, so I'm going to turn to one positive thing. The altmetric indicators, and these are our initial findings, seem to broaden the profile of authors whose work generates attention. So to this, we looked back at gender again. Now, if you look at the left-hand side for citations, you see disciplines in which you have a male dominance are blue, female dominance in pink. In nearly every discipline, except for engineering and technology, men's work is cited more often. When we move to Mendeley, we see two disciplines that have female dominance and fewer that have male dominance. We move to Twitter, we see even more disciplines where there's female dominance and less in male dominance. And as you move to Facebook and other things, we see greater parity. Right? What we want to see across here is an entirely white chart where there's no significant difference by gender for any of these things. And we're starting to see that in some of the platforms. In some ways, the work that is sent out represents women's work. Female work is being represented on these platforms in a way that it isn't being made visible with citations. So now that we know all of this, what do we do? How do we build an infrastructure that can begin to capture this in more systematic ways? So I would argue that our current systems are failing on this. They're failing to capture the requisite variety of scholarly communication. Now, for those of you who are not up on your cybernetic theories, the law of requisite variety says if a system is to be stable, the number of states of its control mechanism must be greater than or equal to the number of states in the system being controlled. Simply put, if we have heterogeneity in our output, we need heterogeneity in our input, and we need to be able to capture that heterogeneity. At present, we're not. Now, we have disruptive changes in who participates in science, how they participate, and how this is measured and rewarded. And right now we're in a time of openness. Openness is the word du jour. It's open science, open access, open data. Everything is open. We've freed. But openness doesn't need to mean feral, right? Open science isn't feral metrics. We don't need to throw away all of our standardization because suddenly we want to be open and transparent. No, in many ways, transparency relies on standardization. So there are many different organizations that have been working towards this. NISO has created standards for collecting altmetrics. Orchid organizes around an individual ID. This allows us to capture all of the heterogeneous events in which one person is associated. Crossgrowth is starting to do this in publications to break out of our sort of dependency on Web of Science and other publication venues. We have things like authorship badges that are being promoted both by the digital humanities community but also by the medical community, saying maybe instead of incentivizing people with authorship, let's incentivize them with expertise. What is your expertise, and can we give you a badge, a reward for those kinds of contributions? The Public Library of Science, which I mentioned earlier, collected all of this and has now adopted the credit taxonomy, which gives even greater standardization to these contributorship data. And my hope would be that other journals will adopt this as well. If they were, we would know more about how labor is distributed in science. The benefit is also incorporating Orchid into this, incorporating XML so that you can mine all of these data with ease. Now my dream would look something like this, though I might change the figure in the middle. But we have a scholar, right? We have an Orchid ID for them. I would like to know who they mentored, where their mentors went. I'd like to know their sociodemographic characteristics, their publication things. I'd like to know what grants they've received. I'd like to have all of these metrics aggregated around this one individual, right? This would tell us so much more about our disparities, about the places where we can make interventions to improve science globally. Now, we have to be careful that while we do this, we don't perpetuate disparities. So in one of our studies, we took just those profile images from Mendeley, from Google Scholar, from Academic Search, and we coded them for your simple, quantitative kinds of things. Is a male or female? How old are they? What race are they? What can you see in the picture? What color of clothes are they wearing? And as you can see, 80% were male, 7% were over 35, they were white, they had head and shoulders, they were indoors, wearing casual black clothing. So essentially they were all Steve Jobs. Now, this becomes problematic when we ask our second question. We said, okay, knowing all of this, we have all this data on over 10,000 images, we know what color they were wearing, how much was showing. Controlling for all of that, we want to see if there's gender differences. So we asked two subjective questions. How professional do you think this person is? And how attractive do you think they are? And I bet you can guess the outcome. Women were seen as significantly more attractive and significantly less professional, controlling for everything else. Wearing black, doing a headshot at same age and same race, you were still less professional. That means two people applying for the same job, the first thing that you do is you search online and you see their picture and you have an implicit bias against them and their level of professionalism. This is really important. So we think about the internet as this great democratizer. We're going to put all of these great profiles online. We have to be aware that this implicit bias still exists. Again, coming back to a thing I mentioned earlier, we need to be able to distinguish attention from impact. Here's another favorite altmetric example where something got published in which they included, should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here? This was cited nearly 7,000 times, and you can guess it was not because of its scientific content. We have to be aware of what's happening when we adopt these metrics. Now, in all of this is avoiding goal displacement. Here is Kim Kardashian wearing her Bill Nye, the science guy shirt. And she's famous in Scientometrics for having an indicator named after her, the Kardashian index. And this looks at the ratio of your production to your tweets. So someone who tweets more than they actually write has a high Kardashian index. Now, this is really important because it reminds us that indicators incentivize behavior. They can change the kinds of behaviors that we have, and we have to be sure that when we're creating an indicator, we know what kind of a scientific workforce it will create. So I'll end on Campbell's law, which I think is a really important one to remember. Campbell said that the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. So we shouldn't let the tweet become the end in itself. So I'd like to thank you, thank the Henderson Lecture, and thank Gary for inviting me.
Questions? Okay, so I'm going to let Cassidy handle questions. We got plenty of time for that, and let's have at it.
Yes.
So hi, I'm a Twitter person a lot, so I'm going to sort of, and I also do big data research methods, and I do social movement research myself. And I want to come with a method critical question here, because in social movement research we see a lot of this Twitter scrapes that miss what's going on about the movement a lot, and I kind of felt, comparing my own experience on social media with some of these findings, is that because you scrape Twitter, and you scrape the public data on Twitter, there's a lot of, well, just like social movements aren't just Twitter, Twitter's profiles aren't just Twitter profiles. What I experienced myself on social media a lot is that I don't get interactions as much, say, from say people in other countries, because they feel like, oh, she's a professor and there's a kind of intimidation. But I get tons of emails from all over the world, from people who say, oh, I saw something you wrote on Twitter, and can I get your paper? I get a lot of emails from people who've since become my colleagues. So your data isn't capturing, I think, with Twitter, because it's so short, I think the interaction, and I agree, there's a lot of clusters, there's sociologists who do cluster with sociologists. But with big data research, this has been, this is part of my area, I think a lot of times people pick what data they can scrape and miss the underlying thing. So if I wanted to give a talk about my own experience being on social media, I would have said maybe half of what you said, people still cluster, there's gender issues, but I would have also said it's one of the most international tools out there we have, along with Facebook groups and other things. So to what degree do you think your findings are being driven by picking the available data, which is Twitter, easy to scrape?
Yeah, I mean, I would take your criticism one step further and say it's even worse than that, in that what we can grab isn't just all of public Twitter, but all of public Twitter that has something identifiable about the science communication. So when we say this is what's happening in science communication, that's what's happening in science communication around a DOI. Who's mostly likely to use a DOI? Scientists, right? There's a lot of conversation that's happening on Twitter that's not grabbed in these things. The same goes, though, for newspapers. So you interact with the news a lot, and so you'll know, right? It's not, I'm going to say, a study that was written by Zeynep that was published in this year in this journal, right, in an easily traceable way, right? They'll say, a study looked at X. Those things are completely missed in Altmetrics. So the promise of Altmetrics that we can grab all of these invisible traces is an unmet promise, right? And I would say in many ways, we're just scraping the very, very top layer, and we are missing a huge iceberg underneath.
So can I ask one more follow-up? Because this is something I'm so used to dealing with. Like the idea that Altmetrics shouldn't necessarily be a metric that we measure. I'm very sympathetic to that because there's a lot of feedback loops in it. Once you get going, and things like that. But on the other hand, is there a way in which it becomes part of non-metrics? It's something you do so that I literally get dozens of emails around the world from students who are like, I saw you on social media, can I get this paper? Can you introduce me to people? There's this, and a lot of mentoring that goes from women to women who kind of aren't as outspoken, but who are kind of like, can I get some mentoring? So how do we reward that activity, but not stuck on the metric part, which I'm not disagreeing, it's misleading.
No, but and that's what the promise and the excitement around it is, right? Is if you can incentivize that, people will engage more in that kind of activity, which is good for science. That mentoring is good for science. That broadening the geographic information is good for science. The problem that we're caught in is that we're not yet grabbing all of the data that would reflect that. So you have to go in one of two directions, right? You say, well, then throw away the whole thing, it's not a good metric, or let's make better Altmetrics. And I'm of that second camp. Let's try to make better Altmetrics to grab that. What we know is we've identified the problems. Let's do better at doing that in actually expanding and broadening what it means to do science and to work in science. Yeah.
So, in your diagram of the world that you would love, with all of this data out there, to me that was the scariest thing ever because I don't do any social media, and I don't like having, on the one hand, you could talk about the value of transparency, but when does that violate privacy? And how does that also play into with the current status of these Altmetrics being data that are owned by corporations that I don't necessarily want to participate in? So, what are some of the complexities around making that data to begin with, as well as making it available?
Absolutely. I mean, ownership is a huge thing, and in my dream, I control what is known about me. And unfortunately, that data already exists about you, whether you want it or not. And that data is being integrated in ways that you may not believe, and it may not accurately reflect the activities that you're doing. So in my dream fantasy world, right, you control what is known about you and who knows that about you. I think that that's a better outcome than the one world that we're currently living in. But I agree with you. There are huge privacy concerns. There are huge potential abuses of that system. But to me, I would err on transparency.
First, I'd like to make some comment on this professor's question. I think the motivation for the very ideal landscape is that that will make an opportunity for yourself to show your full impact.
So I'm being coerced.
So
Is that what
you
you're saying? Coerced
I mean,
into doing it, into releasing data that I would prefer not to release. Thanks.
yeah.
It's already public data though,
It's
so
already- it's not
this is public data, it's how
Yeah.
it's aggregated, which has changed, right? And if you can choose how you make yourself visible and what your profile looks like, that's a lot better than the situation which you're living in now.
And what kind of protections would you put in place to make sure it's not used punitively? Like Internet Movie Database recently said that like actresses, or particularly actresses, can say that they don't want their ages listed.
Right.
Of course, Twitter immediately responded, you can't get that off Wikipedia. But like, have you thought about how you would ensure those kind of protections?
No, I haven't, because that's not a system that I would build as a system I would study.
Okay.
Okay. So I have several questions, but I'll just pick two. The first, I attended Diane's class before, and she mentioned your research of the gender difference. And at that time, I had this question. So this is the time I asked the author yourself. When you showed that men have advantage over women in citations, but the problem is that we don't look at the author's gender when we cite, right? So, have you any idea the relationship between gender and the citation?
Right, so most first names are available on the publication, so there is an implicit understanding of, if not a real understanding of their gender, there is some perceived gender that's associated with that. We also know that people tend to cite in very sociologically driven ways. You cite the people that you know first, the people who are close to you first, right? So the implicit bias around gender may play out there as well. So people are not citing without knowledge of the authors and their names.
Yeah, I mean, we cite usually due to we acknowledge the work of the article, not regarding to the gender of the author who wrote the paper. Okay, yeah, I've got some idea for your explanation. So the second question is, do you think Altmetrics is equal to social media metrics?
That's a really interesting question. So right now, a lot of people are using social media metrics as a broader umbrella for Altmetrics, and some people use it interchangeably. I think the best answer I've heard to this was actually a recent article that Jason Priam did with the Chronicle, in which he said, I hope in 3 years we won't be talking about Altmetrics, we'll just be talking about metrics. And I would agree with that as well. When we start saying something is alt, it's alternative to, we forget that we've been measuring lots of different kinds of metrics before citations. So if it's just citations and things that are not citations, I think that that's not a good capture. I would rather we think about metrics and we have the whole range of them. So I hope we would lose the term altogether.
What do you think is the future development of Altmetrics?
Well, it's interesting. So we have a lot of companies that have bought up Altmetrics. So altmetric.com is owned by Springer, Palm Analytics, right? All of these things in which are being very corporatized. You have a few different Altmetric aggregators that are still nonprofits, but that seems to not be the direction of it. So again, it goes back to issues of control, right? And so do we as a community, if we believe in heterogeneous things, do we want to capture and own this ourselves, or are we going to let this be another metric that is owned by all of these corporate entities? I think it's a very serious question we have to ask in this field.
Okay, sure, thank you.
Yeah, I want to follow up with Melanie's question and a couple of the responses. So one of your responses was that this data is being collected anyway, inevitably, and it's all about how it gets aggregated. So the way I understood your talk is that a lot of this isn't being captured, like mentorship, like the influence, the broader impact. You're saying that we need to properly capture those sort of things so that they can be expressed in metrics, which don't yet exist, which it seems like you would like for those things to exist ideally, and to be able to be quantified, and to be able to be rolled up in how people are incentivized and how they keep their jobs and get promotions and all this sort of thing. So in light of that, do you think you could answer Melanie's question again? Because I think when you say if it's about things that already are captured, that's a certain kind of answer, and I think that owning your identity online and being able to capture all those things that are already kind of part of us is a different question than capturing new things that definitely are not captured yet. And does that change how you think about privacy and incentives and that sort of thing?
Yeah, no, I think that they're part of the same story though, right? So the drive to collect Altmetrics wasn't from a corporation, right? It was from a doctoral student who really started that up, and that became corporately viable, right? There became an economic incentive to own these data, and now they're owned by a corporation. I would love to see mentorship played out, but ProQuest would own these data, right? So I think there's a tension there. We want to explore this heterogeneity of indicators while at the same time understanding who owns them. Do we have the capacity to own and control them as an academic community, or are we going to give that up to other things? Now, the answer, this is already being collected about you. For example, Academic Analytics, right, which is a company that sells data about scholars back to the institution for $500,000. A lot of that data has been shown to be inaccurate for the scholars, and they say, I want to be able to see my record. Well, no, the contract the institution signs with Academic Analytics says, no, you can't see your record. You can't know what the institution knows about you when they're making decisions about the allocation of resources. So my answer is, I want us to know what's known about us when it's already being collected stands as well. So I think we're in a tension in both of those spaces. Many people are collecting the publicly available data about us, aggregating those, commodifying those, and selling them back to different institutions and decision makers in our lives. We should have some say in that. We should be able to control that. Do I want to say, let's leave all metrics behind because we don't control it? No, I don't want that world either. So I think that it's navigating those tensions that I think is important.
Possibly it'd be more regulated. Sometimes we like your credit ratings. But, you know, a few years ago, you couldn't know what people knew about your credit ratings, and now because of new laws, you are allowed to know and put in corrections. So possibly in this new world, they'll
Opportunities for redress are really important in this space. Yeah.
I'm Lucile Kelling, and I have a question about the data collection. I'm just curious, how do you know which part or which author contribute to which part of the articles? I thought there was
Yeah, so this is the contributorship data we had from PLOS does that, well, sort of explicitly. Now it does with its new credit taxonomy, but at the time of our data collection, it would have the author initials. So it would say, conceive the experiment and the author initials. So we had to match the author initials back to the author names in order to draw that link. But that's only available at scale in an XML format for the Public Library of Science. Other places like BMJ will collect that, but in just text, basically. So you have to parse through all of that text to pull those out. So there's not very many journals that have adopted sort of large-scale identification of contributorship data.
The second question, can you go back to the Beatles picture? I was thinking, may I take a picture of the Beatles?
Which
the Beatles picture?
Which one?
The Ph.D.
Oh, the Minions. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and that is not my picture, but the attribution is on it. Oh, there we go. Yeah, Paul Coxon. Yes.
Could you say a little bit about the gender identification algorithm?
Yeah.
I mean, especially for Asian names, it's very tough.
That's the worst part for it. So it has the least accuracy for Asian names. So it starts out with U.S. Census Bureau, and we use that in order to identify things that are high probability for male or for female. We also use last names for many former Soviet countries, and that those are indicative of gender. So we also look at different countries. So if you're from France and your name is Jean, and you're from the U.S. and it's Jean, right? So looking at geography plays into the algorithm in different ways. So for the Web of Science data, we use those sort of name lists and name heuristics on it. For the Twitter data, when we had visual, we actually use a software called Face++, which then is assigning gender based on visual recognition cues.
Traditional metrics, when you're looking at citations or even looking at an alt metric that's based on something like Twitter, you're measuring that metric within a system that is global, essentially. There's a citation that has a DOI, there's only one paper linked to that citation, and the tweets, you're referencing the DOI. When you move into some of the more subjective measurements like mentorship or teaching ability, how can you work with all of these disparate local systems, ways that different places measure success, different individuals measure their success, and turn it into a metric system where we can make useful comparisons?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the limitation of all indicators is the indicators are always proxies for something else, right? So citations are not equated with impact, they're a proxy for it. publications are not productivity, but they're a proxy for it. In the same way, we're using Twitter and proxies for these things. So we'll never capture everything, but in the way that we're using those spaces, what we have to be sure is that the concept is well aligned with what we think it's a proxy for. And I'm not sure that we're there on Altmetrics yet. For mentorship, for example, Gary and I worked extensively on this of taking Ph.D. advisorships and quantifying that. So is every Ph.D. advisor a mentor? Not always. I mean, in my case, he was. But not always, right? But it's a fairly good proxy for mentorship of looking at those advising lists. And so I think we do that. We make those decisions. What is the closest proxy that we can have to that? There's always loss and there's always a bit of error. We try to reduce that error to the extent possible.
Maybe one more time for one more question? Going once?
If no more, yeah. About, can I just say? Yeah. When you talk about the demographic data to users, you find that so over 30% of them have PhD or the degree. And you said that it's not representing the truth. But I'm thinking that the public, how do we define the public from the scientific? The public people could have the degree, right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
I'm thinking that as people are, more and more people are getting well educated, so that they could have a degree that working in engineering or companies. So that's what I understand as public. So
Right.
that's not conflict.
And I think, but what we see is that we have sort of a low degree of false positives, but a high degree of false negatives in all of this stuff, right? We don't know what's missing in these data. Now, Twitter has made an agreement with Orchid to begin putting Orchid IDs into the Twitter handles, which again becomes another indicator of someone who's integrated in the scientific workforce, whether they have a PhD or not. And I think that that will be exciting in sort of distinguishing these, but it's still a methodological challenge.
Well, let's, before we thank Cassidy one more time, I just want to let everyone know where there'll be a reception outside, so she'll be available for some individual conversations. Don't dominate all of her time, but give other folks a chance. But let's thank Cassidy again.